Alright, diving in here, life in East Africa. This is probably my favorite video and favorite section in this chapter and this topic of East Africa. A lot of information here. Going to try to unpack it all. Pretty different kind of topics we're going to talk about here. So the driving question today is, what are the key elements of culture in East Africa today? So there's certain things that we really could say this defines all of these people from these various countries. Maybe kind of hard to do that by the end of this video. Not going to see maybe exactly similarities in some of the things that are presented. So, um, people usually either live in cities or in the rural areas. Africa in some places is very, very crowded, in other places not so much. So there's, definitely a difference between some people live in cities. You got Mogadishu here in Somalia. You can see fairly crowded. They got skyscrapers and things like that. Nairobi, Kenya, maybe you've heard of before. But then there's a lot of people that live outside of the cities as well. So Ethiopia has the largest population in East Africa, at 80 million people. For reference, the United States is about 300 million, but significantly larger in size too. So population density is something that has to be kind of taken in here. Rwanda has one of the highest population densities, so it means it's very, very crowded. Lots of people packed in together in tight areas. Also means that there may be not enough resources like water, or not every child has access to education, those types of things, access to medical treatment. So you can see these are the populations here. Ethiopia having the highest population, and these numbers don't really agree. So I wonder if one of them is earlier and one of them is later. So maybe need to fix that on the slide. So just some differences in numbers, but population density is something to kind of keep in mind here in East Africa. There's a lot of ethnic groups, different backgrounds. We kind of talked about that with the Rwanda genocide and the Hutus and the Tutsis, just ethnic differences between groups. Not all African people from one country are exactly the same. Lots of languages are spoken. We mentioned Swahili in the second video. Swahili and English tend to be official languages. There are other European languages from the time of imperialism that are still spoken. Arabic is also spoken in some areas as well. So this is a nice little chart here that shows you the number of languages spoken. I think my favorite part of this is that Ethiopia has 4 official languages, and they were the only country not to be colonized. So you can't say, well, they have all these languages just because of colonization. Not totally true. You see English and French look like the only ones up there of European languages. So I guess Arabic would have been not from Africa either. But so the other languages, the ones that maybe wouldn't be as familiar to us, the words that we wouldn't see up here, are probably Swahili languages and languages that are tribal from these African people themselves. Religions, mainly Christianity and Islam, are the 2 most common religions, but there are indigenous religions as well. I already kind of talked about the rural and the city life and just the differences between those two. So here's kind of some pictures that show the kind of the more the rural life and these nomadic people that live there. Art, oral traditions. This is an art style called Tinga Tinga. And it's kind of interesting. There's a Tinga Tinga Tales is like a British show. It's not from Africa, that kind of does all of its artwork in that style. So artwork that came out of East Africa, some music that's talked about, and literature. Can I skip over some of that for right now to get to these last kind of points that I wanted to make? I think we'll skip past that. So one of the things in East Africa is the conservation of wildlife. You can see here the gorillas. We'll talk about a little bit this when we move into the Congo of Central Africa as well. So there's a lot to preservation of life outside of human life, but animal life as well. This is one of my favorite things to talk about because I am a runner. So East Africa, particularly Ethiopia and Kenya, this little chart here on the left kind of shows you that this is their sport. I mean, soccer may be played as well, but they dominate long distance running, particularly the marathon. So these guys right here, the guy on the right is Geoffrey Mutai. You can see some of their times below 2-hour mark. For reference, these guys are running like 4.5-minute miles. So if you've ran the mile in PE, maybe the fastest kids, can break out maybe a 6-minute mile. They're running 4.5-minute miles, and they're doing it for 26 miles straight. Just recently, kind of current event news it was in the spring, Nike sponsored a thing to try to break the 2-hour mark. It's never been done. No athlete on earth has ever broken the 2-hour mark. And it was a set of 3 African runners. I think 2 of them were Kenyans, and one of them was an Ethiopian that's set to do it. And the official time was like 2 hours and 34 seconds. Like, he almost did it. So most people think that that record will fall at some point, and it probably will be done by an East African. And one of the things to remember is that, East Africa is often fairly poor. So many of these guys, world-class athletes. They participate in like the Boston Marathon and New York City Marathon, get thousands of dollars, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars for winning, and that is huge sums of money to take home. Some of them have sponsorships. You see both these guys wearing Adidas stuff. So it's one of those things that you kind of have to focus on. Like, they run because they love it, but it's also, life-changing, more so than someone becoming a professional athlete here in our country, in the United States. So that's kind of what this talks about here, the economic development, just kind of struggling conditions that have existed in Africa over the years, and just trying to improve that, improving economies, and some of the methods that they've used to do that. Civil wars obviously are getting in the way of that happening, using national parks and things like that to try to encourage tourism. This is another thing I wanted to talk about. So kind of along with poverty and struggling conditions, maybe you've heard about this before, but Somalia is particularly famous for pirates. And I know we all picture, like Captain Jack Sparrow pirates, but that's not exactly what we're talking about here. And if you've seen the movie Captain Phillips, you're basically seeing that story of Somalian pirates that try to board a cargo ship. And just this whole story of what it was a international incident when it occurred. Interesting enough, this guy right here in the lower left, he was one of the Somalian pirates. He is the only one that's captured in that. So spoiler alert, if you want to know the movie, he is captured. He's not successful in stealing the boat, and he is serving his sentence in a federal prison in Terre Haute. So only like an hour from here. So it's kind of interesting, close to home. So if you've ever seen the movie Captain Phillips, I strongly encourage you. I think it's like PG-13, but it's really good. Kind of really helps you kind of understand, like, why would these guys do that? What's their method? What are they trying to do? And I think often it's just, they're trying to make money. So they try to steal millions of dollars of cargo. And sometimes they're successful, but it's just a really interesting dynamic of something that's going on in East Africa, and continues to be a problem. So a lot of what like Coast Guards have to do, and even like maybe like the navies of countries is to patrol the waters, looking out for these pirates in these like tiny boats that are trying to board these boats, large cargo boats, and try to take over and take the cargo. So just kind of a really interesting thing. So other challenges, health issues, malnutrition and starvation are big problems. You can see here this is probably clean water in all these yellow containers. It could also be, yeah, I probably think that's what it is. This truck is probably carrying fresh water. So, and then just access to food too. Things that we really take for granted. We'll brush our teeth and leave the sink running. We'll take a 30 or 40-minute shower and don't think a thing about it. But in these countries where water is a limited resource, it really is, that it could run out. You really kind of just paints a different picture of what life would be like in other places. HIV and AIDS is a big thing. Often passed from mother to child. There's not really treatment. There are drugs that can be used to treat it, cannot be cured. And I think that there have been made advances. There's the Red Cross and other world organizations are helping in that area, but still a problem. So this is kind of a video that talks about that, I believe. It's a 60-minute special, so I can't remember what this one's officially about, but might be something to kind of check out. We'll talk about more of this even in West Africa and other kind of epidemics that have happened in it as far as disease go. And that kind of brings us into this. So look at some of these life expectancies. The life expectancy in the United States is 78.5 years of age. Most of my grandparents lived into their 80s or 90s, and you see like 51 in Somalia. Like, that is really, really low. So It's just one of those things to keep in mind that, like many people in other countries, especially Africa, very low life expectancy. People don't live nearly as long. So kind of really paints a kind of a bummer of a picture, but it's an accurate picture and one that I think still comes back to imperialism. That all that what happened when the Europeans kind of came in is just kind of set Africa up for failure because they weren't allowed to be their own people and to create their own governments. And then when Europe pulled out, just poverty, disease, war existed, and that created just more problems. So I think a lot of the world knows about this and is helping Africa, and Africa is trying to help itself. It's got great leaders that have stepped up. We'll talk about some of those as we move through, particularly like in South Africa. We'll talk about Nelson Mandela and just his role. So I think things are starting to look up a little bit for Africa, but there's a long way to go. You know, HIV, AIDS, malaria are huge killers of people, access to education. So the story's not done for Africa, but this kind of shows you just how bad the conditions can be in Africa. So kind of showing you a lot of stuff, everything from, you know, super elite athletes to pirates to low life expectancy. So there's a lot going on in East Africa. And there's not really one thing that I would say defines that country. You know, there is poverty, but then there is, you know, success in sports. So it's just an interesting area of Africa.